Unfortunately, I think some people still think that, but I think they will wake up to a harsh reality. And that actually brings me back to what we discussed much earlier about also why the SMEs should care.
I tried to listen to 3 podcasts about it. On one, I fell asleep.
That even though it sounds really complicated, it is in essence still just a long list. So all it takes is for me or someone else to sit down and put all of this into an Excel sheet.
On one, I really struggled to listen to the end. And one, yes, I did understand it. He's a taxonomy fan. I have to push.
Yeah, well, it's...
Okay.
There's one more. So this is where it gets a bit, maybe I should push the
I'm
bullshit
closing
button.
up to the button.
Yeah,
here.
I could see that you were, so I thought I beat you to it. No, because there's one more.
Welcome back to The Switch, not another podcast, a podcast where we want to entertain you, educate you about everything that can help us do the switch to the green transition. We are doing this together with DNB and Baseload Capital and together with you, of course. I hope that you made sure to subscribe and also share this episode to someone you want to be a part of the green transition. My name is Kristina Hagström-Ilievska and I'm the naive optimist with rebellic streaks that dares to push the awesome button and the bullshit button. And behind the scenes, my true friends, producers, Jacob and Emil. Are we ready for today?
Yeah, we're ready. We're totally ready. Looking forward to it. Yeah.
Because we have a new exciting guest for you to meet here today. Let us move right into the segment where you get introduced to him. We are meeting the Green Investment Manager with an inclination for strategic development and process structuring. He is an EU Taxonomy and ESG enthusiast. Interesting, but he's seeking for a sweet spot in pragmatism and regulation when he goes into this. Recently, one of his good deeds for the planet is that he sold the family car. I wonder what the wife said about that, but he started biking to work. As for guilty pleasure, he occasionally enjoys meat dish when dining out, otherwise probably vegetarian. We'll see, we can ask him. And today he will entertain us, educate us about the EU taxonomy. Welcome, Søren.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
It's a pleasure of having you here. You're here because we want to learn more about the EU taxonomy. So I have been trying to read up on this, and I have to be honest, the boys behind the scene, they were laughing with me. I tried to listen to 3 podcasts about it. On one, I fell asleep. On one, I really struggled to listen to the end. And one, yes, I did understand it. But this is exactly why you're here today, because you have expertise in this area, working at Nefco, to make us understand this in an easy and a good way. Are you ready for that?
I'm definitely ready for that. And if I should be honest, I sometimes fall asleep when I'm listening to those webinars too.
Oh, thank you.
So you're not the only one.
I'm pushing the awesome button here directly. Good, thank you very much. But before we actually run into this, we would like to get to know you as a person a little bit better. So you are going to get one of the 21 questions. I don't know which one you're going to get. So let's see. Let's spin the wheel.
All right.
Wheel of questions. What would you sing at karaoke night?
That's actually an awesome question because I never sing publicly. I do sing at home sometimes.
In the shower.
In the shower, everyone else, I guess. But if I was forced to at karaoke night, I would probably pick something like The Final Countdown or like one of those old classics that I probably would remember all the words to and not somehow make myself too embarrassed. But yeah, funnily enough, when it comes to singing, I try to do it not when other people are listening to me. That's
my absolute sweet spot is in the car.
That's actually true.
Yeah.
I do that too.
Yeah, good.
But
but the interesting thing is when someone drives by and you're still singing. That's a good one. Let's continue and see what the next question is.
Wheel of questions. Who is your hero and what is your proudest accomplishment?
Well, I think those are actually really difficult questions to answer because there's so many awesome people in the world. If I start with the proudest accomplishment, because even that I think is difficult, but somehow I would look at my kids. Like I have 3 wonderful kids that are getting older and they are definitely becoming more and more aware of climate change and all of these issues and are actively engaging, at least the oldest one, who is now 14 almost, in issues like that. So I think I've had a very good influence on them so far.
That's
when
good.
it comes to those, and I think that I'm pretty proud of that.
So your heroes is your family?
I would say so.
I think you should say your wife.
well, that is true. She's definitely a hero of mine. No doubt about that.
Good. Yeah. Let's have that as one. And let's go to the final question of today's Spinning the Wheel. Let's spin the wheel.
Wheel of questions. What did you want to be when you were small?
I think the memory I have of what I wanted to be when I was small, the clearest was probably when I was 10. And I really wanted to become a construction engineer, or like an engineer, I guess it would be in English, but in Danish we have this specific kind of engineers that builds houses. I thought it was the most awesome thing to sit and draw houses on paper with the millimeter squares and make plans, floor plans, and think of how they could be built. I was a bit of a geek, I guess. Nothing has changed much.
Well, then I have to ask you, because then we're actually moving into to the next part here. How did that dream become EU Taxonomy expert?
Well, I guess it is the nerd or geek in me that somehow created a path between that. I've always been into things with math and I like things that are square. But I really like things that are square because I like to know how to break the boundaries of them. So I think it's sort of this combination of starting to draw houses on a piece of paper and slowly moving into, well, not just taxonomy, but many things in my professional career and in my life where I'm sort of want to understand the squares so I can figure out how do we expand them.
Let's move into that because I really want to understand the square of EU taxonomy when I leave here today. So let me ask you a simple question, which is really, how would you explain the EU taxonomy in its simplest way?
In its simplest way, the EU taxonomy is a list of definitions of what is green. Or of course, in the language of the EU taxonomy, they would say what is sustainable. So it's a long list.
It's a long list of what? Questions?
No, it's a long list of answers. It's a long list of answers to the question, what is sustainable? So I think it obviously boils down to the problem that we have had for years, that everyone wants to do something sustainable or green. This has been something, or not everyone, but this is something we've been seeing for 15, 20 years at least, to becoming more and more of a trend. And the problem has always been that no one has been able to say, is it actually green what you're doing? So until recently, I could be a company producing furniture and I would say this furniture is green. And then I would say it's green because I sourced my wood from something that is FSC, so Forest Council Stewardship certified, and that has certain criteria. And that would be maybe my claim to why it's green.
And that would be greenwashing for me.
Well, it could be, exactly. Because it doesn't necessarily say anything about all the other aspects that would be relevant to look at to determine whether it's green. And the EU taxonomy, even though maybe on forestry, which is one of the contested areas still, I guess, sets up specific criteria for what you have to do as a minimum in order to, under that standard, to say that something is green. But of course, like everything else, it's a standard that has been set by someone. But I think that's maybe also what I like, and one of the reasons why I see myself as a, taxonomy fan.
He's a taxonomy fan.
It's because it's science-based. It's supposed to be outside of politics. Of course, it's not outside of politics, and I think we'll talk about that maybe later. But it's supposed to be. And they started with a group of more than 200 scientists in fields, any field you can imagine. And then at some point they narrowed it down to 57. So they have a lot of scientists in various fields that are saying, well, according to most recent research, these are the criteria. This is the specific requirement. This is as much emissions that you can have, or you have to have this kind of water treatment in place, or you have to have this energy saving measures or things like that. Mm-hmm. In order for it to be better, in order for it to have a substantial contribution to one of these objectives that they have.
Why do we actually need EU taxonomy?
So we need it because without the taxonomy, anyone could say, well, this book that I produced here, it's super green and it's fantastic because I have now put this stamp on it and, well, it's just this. And I could, of course, ask critical questions, but then it would be you and me discussing whether I think it's green or you think it's green, and there would be no resolution to that. Mm-hmm. So the EU taxonomy is important because it gives us this checklist. It gives us a list. So in essence, if you say it's green, I can check, and then it might still be green in one way or another, but at least I can say, well, according to the list that I'm using as a reference point, it's not.
So it makes it more objective?
I think it does, definitely.
Good explanation. How are the sustainable economic activities defined under EU taxonomy?
In essence, they are defined in 6 ways. But first, I think it's important to understand what an economic activity is. And so an economic activity would be whatever your company is doing. So you might be a company selling shoes, or you could be a company producing pipes for the oil industry, or you could be, well, any kind of company. So whatever it is you do. And of course, some companies does one thing, and some companies might do 100 different things. So in terms of how you then define these, both the economic activities, but especially what a substantial contribution is, you have to look at the different objectives. So when they did the EU taxonomy regulation, they said, well, there are 6 different objectives under which we see that we can make substantial contributions that are sustainable. So ways of making sustainable choices or sustainable activities under these 6 objectives. And as an example, of course, but as an example, the first one, the climate change mitigation, which is the one everyone talks about, maybe too much, but nonetheless, there it's pretty simple. So there is a definition in the taxonomy regulation saying that, well, to have a substantial contribution to the objective of climate change mitigation, you need to support the Paris Agreement goals. So your activities has to either avoid or reduce greenhouse gas emissions to an extent that would support achieving the Paris Agreement goals.
All right.
So it for that one, it's pretty simple. But then if it was circular economy or pollution prevention and control or some of the others, the list can be longer. But I think the beauty of all that is that as a company or a financial institution, you don't really need to concern yourself too much about that question, because that question has already been answered by the platform on sustainable finance and by the technical working group that came before that. So the long list of economic activities that is already available, where they're saying these are the criteria for which renting out bikes would be considered a sustainable activity that has a substantial contribution, well, that's already done. So you as a company don't really need to care about that.
Okay. In that sense, what are the conditions that an economic activity has to meet in order to qualify?
Well, again, and this is, I think, where there is some confusion. When you read the taxonomy, and especially if you listen to webinars that we talked about in the beginning, they will always start by saying there are 4. And then for a long time, I got really confused because as I said, I don't think the first one really matters if I'm a company or if I'm a financial institution. So I would say there's 3. So the first one to check is, of course, whether it fulfills the technical screening criteria. When you see that the screening criteria is good and that you fulfill those, well, then you need to look at whether your activity fulfills the criteria of do no significant harm to any of the other 5. So I think I haven't mentioned them all. So there's climate change mitigation, there's climate change adaptation, then there is sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and the last one is protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So in essence, those are the 6 objectives. And when you have seen that, well, mine fulfills the screening criteria on the climate change mitigation, you need to check that I'm not doing any harm in any of the other 5. This is again where I love the taxonomy, because that's very square. They have said, here is a box, Appendix A tells you what are the criteria specifically for not doing significant harm under climate change adaptation, for instance. So you can go and check. And well, once you have checked them all 5 and said, well, and quite often it might be that there are no criteria. So in essence, you need to have a plan in place that shows how you might be affected by climate change, your activities. That would be the climate change adaptation part. And then you need to have a plan in place or a measure in place to make sure that your parts are recycled and these kind of things.
Okay.
There's one more. So this is where it gets a bit, maybe I should push the
I'm
bullshit
closing
button.
up to the button.
Yeah, I could see that you were, so I thought I beat you to it. No, because there's one more, and that's then the minimum social safeguards. So once you have done all of these, it's not enough that it's sustainable and that you're saving CO2 emissions and that you are not doing any harm to the other objectives, environmental objectives. You also have to make sure that whatever you do lives up to the minimum social safeguards. And that's a whole nother podcast, actually. They just released an explanation document, which is, I forget, is it 40 pages long, trying to somehow paint out what does that actually mean? Because the problem with, the challenge with the minimum social safeguards is that they are referring to OECD guidelines, they are referring to the Bill of Rights, Human Bill of Rights, International Bill of Human Rights, and they're referring to guiding principles by the UN. So a whole plethora of documents. And now they are finally trying to make that simple to understand because it's not. And I think in the beginning, a lot of companies thought that, well, if we operate in the Nordics, we follow the Nordic rules, we'll live up to all of these. But the reality has been that some of the criteria under these minimum social safeguards are so complicated that you probably won't be living up to them.
I have to, because this to me sounds so complicated and so many things I need to do. Isn't it stopping us to do the right things? Are we helping the companies with this, or are we actually making them a lot more work?
Well, I think that 2 points in that are important to sort of separate. One is, of course, that at the moment, the EU Taxonomy and the reporting directives related to it are only looking at large and listed companies. So they would have the resources, most of them at least, they should have the resources to actually look into these things. Small and medium-sized companies are not included. They will be included if they're listed to some extent in this new directive that's coming up on corporate sustainability reporting. But that's still only a small fragment of them. So in essence, I don't think it doesn't stop anyone in that sense. I definitely think that the EU Commission or the Platform on Sustainable Finance could do a lot more to make it easier to understand.
Yeah.
Because I know that I now made it sound really complicated. It was kind of on purpose because I wanted to get to the point also that even though it sounds really complicated, it is in essence still just a long list. So all it takes is for me or someone else, I probably won't have the time because I also have to work with investments on the companies that we're trying to finance, to sit down and put all of this into an Excel sheet. And at the end, you'll have a long list of questions to answer. And for some companies, it'll be a short list. For some companies, it will be a long list. But even though there are references to 100 different EU directives having different kind of standards you need to live up to, it's still a finite list that you can put into an Excel sheet. And in reality, what I really want to do, but maybe I'll save that to later, is that someone should make software.
Did you hear that? Someone should make software. At what stage are we currently, and what's the timeline when it comes to the EU taxonomy?
So the taxonomy regulation was published already in 2021, or actually 2020. And we're now at the stage where the first 2 objectives, so the climate change mitigation and the climate change adaptation, are fully adopted and in place. It's of course important to understand that it's a living document, so there will most likely come updates and changes like we saw with with gas and natural gas and nuclear. But those are in place. And companies are supposed to, according then to the reporting directives, to report large and listed companies are supposed to now, and financial institutions.
Let's clarify that. So the EU taxonomy is still focused on the big corporation right now.
Well, I like to say that the EU taxonomy is for everyone, but that the reporting directives, which it refers to, so the place where it actually puts requirement on someone to do something, those are only looking at the large and listed companies and financial institutions. Those are not important. They are important to remember. They also have to report.
I mean, in the end, it's a good thing that we demand people to start thinking about these questions and having them in mind when it comes to everything they do in business and such.
Yes.
When it comes to nations, we had a guest here before, Magnus, from Clean Tech Scandinavia. He had a point. I mean, this is an EU taxonomy, right? Why do we develop like these formats? Because there are more formats than the EU taxonomy. Why don't we, for example, his suggestion then, change how we measure the GDP?
I actually think that's a super interesting idea, but I think there are two things to it in my mind here on sort of on top of my head. And one is, of course, that changing how you measure GDP is probably going to meet a lot of pushback because it's a well-defined thing that's already in place and so on.
Isn't that exactly why it should be good to do the changes there and then not?
No, because I don't think those two things exclude each other. Because in essence, what I think is that the EU taxonomy is reflecting on how everything is reported at least in the countries within the EU. So I would love to see the states also reporting according to the EU taxonomy in some way or other. That would be super interesting. So if that's what you meant, then it's a little bit of a different question. But sort of in general, I think that we're actually getting the results we want because it's an EU directive. Because I think the problem is that if it would be a GDP reporting something, then, well, first of all, we would be talking about the world. So you would have 200 nations plus minus who would need to somehow agree that this is the thing, or then some wouldn't and some would. And at least here
okay, yeah.
Yeah, but at least within the EU, we now have agreement. So
well, that is awesome. I must agree with that. I mean, it is awesome that we have something that we've agreed about and that this is rolling out.
Yeah, and then also I think that what I'm seeing, or not what I'm seeing, but what is happening is that I think it's South Africa who came out with a taxonomy looking at the EU taxonomy. There are others around the world that are either copying or coming out with their own taxonomies outside of the EU. So it definitely has inspired, and then somehow my impression is that everyone is at least trying to align. And then of course that is, well, I guess a global politics challenge that of course various interests will then make various results, but nonetheless, at least within the EU, we have something, and we have a lot of financial power. So
yeah, definitely. But to that point again, I mean, in EU, for example, they made a decision that certain gas and nuclear is actually sustainable, which is in the EU taxonomy, right? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Because now we are.
Yes. So I think that's a disaster. To be very sort of blunt about it, it's definitely the opposite of awesome. If I should push the bullshit button, because the whole process around it is I think has been, well, to say it the least interesting, because that was a political decision. So everything in the EU taxonomy has until now been based on this technical working group. It's been based on this platform on sustainable finance and the experts there. And when the Commission suggested this addition, all of these scientists came out and said, hey, but this is not aligned with the criteria we otherwise have for what would be sustainable. But for political reasons, it was decided that it was necessary to add this. So in that sense, I think it's a big mistake. On the other hand, I'm not sure if I'm looking at it from sort of a real political perspective, I don't think it's going to have a big effect. Because I think that
was actually my next question. What does this decision mean for the future of EU taxonomy?
Luckily, I don't think it will have a big effect. I think the negative impact it will have is that it takes away some of the credibility. If once you start introducing things into the EU taxonomy, which is not necessarily science-based, or at least where there is a big debate in the science community on who is right, well, then of course it becomes less trustworthy, I think. On the other hand, because the EU taxonomy is really just a list of answers to the question of what is green, and it's only if you have to report on it that then, well, you can include your gas and your nuclear activities when you report, but you will still have to say that I have nuclear and gas activities, and then we can look at it and decide, do we agree? So I think that in reality, that's what's going to happen, that there will be some, and then if you're a green investor, well, in Nefco, we exclude fossil fuels, for instance. So we wouldn't, even if it's taxonomy aligned, we're not going to start, at least the things are now, financing anything that has to do with natural gas. So it's a bit of a thorn in the eye, but I don't think it's going to have a real...
I guess it's an uncomfortable conversation that needs to be had in a sense. But I mean, again, we need to bring the oil and gas industry with us into the transition as well. So definitely making measurements for everyone is a good way of moving forward as well. So we talked about now that the EU Taxonomy is a help on the way to become more sustainable. It's help for you as an individual, as a company, in the end also your country and also EU. This change that we need, is it possible?
I definitely think it's possible. And I think that we will make this change so that others in the future will be able to benefit from it. We can. There's no doubt that the technologies that are necessary, and now with the EU Taxonomy, we have a tool of actually putting a line in the sand and saying this is what is needed to achieve these goals that we need to have a sustainable future. So yes, I think we can make it. No doubt about that. I guess I'm sometimes when it's late at night and I've been reading too much about it, I'm not always positive that we will. I think that there are many parts like adding nuclear and gas into the mix that pulls in the other direction. But I'm always optimistic in the sense that I know we will get to that point. We will make the change, but how much we will have to endure before we get there is maybe what keeps me up sometimes at night. So how do you say, cautiously optimistic?
Cautiously optimistic. Thank you. It's time for a question from the future.
Questions from our future.
How can we make everyone work together?
I think everyone is to some extent already working together, but we definitely need to do more. And I think that things like, and this is again where I might become a bit too much of a geek and like stuff like the EU Taxonomy, I think things like the EU Taxonomy is something that's pushing us in a direction where we have to pool our resources and start working together. Because we're now making specific requirements, so we all need to help each other to understand it. And I definitely think that's sort of the policymaker in me, or I'm not a policymaker, but sort of the one who likes policies, sees that as a way of pushing things forward. Obviously, I'm not blind to the fact that there will be things that will be pulling in different directions. But still, I think that this is definitely one way of making us working together. And then I think, unfortunately, this is maybe then the darker side to it. I think necessity will make us work together. So as climate change progresses, we will have to.
There's no actual choice here.
I don't think so. I think if we don't really work together in some near future, or as I said, I think we're already doing it, but definitely there is room for more collaboration, and then things will be much more dire. But that's why I'm hopeful. I definitely think that we will, and that we can, and that we are already doing that and moving in that direction all the time. So yes, despite all of the things in the world, I do think that we can and will work together.
Let's move on to have some uncomfortable conversations.
Uncomfortable conversations.
If this is such a good thing, why don't more people understand it already?
Well, I think there are two answers to that question. One is the provocative answer, and the other one is maybe the more constructive answer. But I'll do them both, because I think one reason is, unfortunately, that when the EU and when the Commission and when these working groups, as much as I love the Platform on Sustainable Finance and think what they're doing is great, when they do this, they're so focused on it being for large and listed companies and somehow someone with lots of resources. They completely forget that 90% of our world is not that. And then it becomes this big bureaucratic, now we have a 900-page report. And this is what then also brings me to why I loved it, because the taxonomy, because it is simple. You could make a piece of software. You could make something that would be available for anyone to search and plug in your information, and then it would give you the answers. But of course, I think, to be fair, the reason why people haven't understood it yet in that sense is that, or if I should be fair to the Commission and the people there, is of course that they also have to be sure that they get the whole package in place and that everything is correct and you know, all the boxes are checked. So I guess they haven't had the resources yet to get to that point.
If I play a bit of like devil's advocate here, do you think that people think it's just another sweet paper policy that just going to be on the table and we don't need it?
Unfortunately, I think some people still think that, but I think they will wake up to a harsh reality. And that actually brings me back to what we discussed much earlier about also why the SMEs should care, is that even though it's only for large and listed companies, the fact is that as an SME, well, you might be in the supply chain of a large and listed company. So even if you don't want to say what you're doing is green, well, the large and listed company needs to buy something from you, and that can have an effect on them being able to say what they're doing is green. So it's basically thrive or survive here. You need to do it because otherwise you will not be picked. Well, that's definitely one of the risks, I would say. It's again, the world is big and there are many things going on. So it's depending on what you're doing and as a company, but that is definitely a reason why they should listen. Well, I think we need to have a lot more conversations that are uncomfortable on what is sustainable, like what should be included and what should not be included. And I think that, for instance, the oil and gas and the natural gas and the nuclear that was included is definitely one of those where I feel the conversation wasn't really had. Like and even though it's still lingering there, it has to be decided. It's been passed by the Commission. It's been passed by the Parliament. It's just there now. I can see that as we add more and more economic activities, there will be more and more uncomfortable conversations around that. But then I also think that it is an uncomfortable conversation, the whole idea of what the stress will this put on small and medium-sized companies or people like smaller companies, like, because there's no doubt, even though I like to say that it's simple and it's square and it's easy, the fact is also there is no tool made for a small and medium-sized company to really understand this. So at the moment, they are looking into a big black box that can be very hard to find the time to understand. And I think we have to find a solution to that. And as you probably know, there are tons of these software companies providing software for financial institutions, and they're doing lots in the taxonomy. I'm looking forward to someone telling me about one that isn't focused on large and listed companies. Because so far I can only find the ones that are looking into taking data automatically from the internet on the listed companies and aggregating that and showing whether they're then living up to the taxonomy or not, but not for the small and medium-sized.
Who should be a part of this conversation?
Well, I think that the small and medium-sized companies and the stakeholders around that whole ecosystem needs to get into this conversation much more. I think that there is a tendency that we think that it doesn't really concern us yet. It's great that there's the taxonomy, but it's way too complicated. It's going to make our life hard. So let's just, large and listed companies, they can. But the reality is that it has an effect. And it has a direct effect, as on being in the supply chain. You might have to actually deliver to someone who has to say that what they're doing is green. Well, they can only do that potentially if what you're doing is green. And then you need to be able to show to them that you're actually living up to these criteria. Or if you need financing, like there's more and more financing being channeled towards things that are labeled green. And now within the EU, you can only say that your financing is green if it lives up to the taxonomy. Again, strictly speaking, if you're financing large and listed companies, no one is caring about the small and medium-sized in this conversation. But that's what I think we need to start. And I think that's where we all need to participate, because I think it's a huge mistake to exclude that whole thing, even if it might look complicated and difficult. And this is where I think, give us 150,000 euros and a good software designer will make someone who is good at that, not me, could make a program. Like it is, in that sense, what I really love about the taxonomy is that it is, in that sense, square. It's a huge list of questions that needs to be answered because of directives and whatnot that it relates to. But it is a finite list, so you could really build something up around it that would be accessible for small and medium-sized companies, and not some big expensive system they need to buy into, but really a tool to help them. And this is maybe where I'm an ideologist. I don't think that it's a real business case yet around it. So that's why no one is doing it. So for that reason, I think someone should do it and then put it out there, and then businesses can then start. So one
conversation that I would like to see is that the EU has a conversation with someone who can actually develop this software, right?
They could be one actor, definitely. Yeah. I would love them to do it, but I do think... I think the EU is too focused on the large and listed companies, if I'm being somehow. But yes, I would love to see the EU doing this. And they have so much research funding and support for all kinds of things. So why not?
Why not?
I don't think it would be that expensive.
Hopefully not. And if you are sitting out there looking and having a spark right now, go for it.
Yeah, or if you know of a software that's already available and where companies can put in their own data and say, this is what I do, and then it'll check on all the lists and spit it out, then I would so love to hear about that.
Good. You have someone to reach out to, right?
Definitely.
Good. On that note, it's time for Sunshine.
Sunshine.
I think when I'm thinking of Sunshine, it's always again, like I said, with the heroes, there can be so many. But actually, I recently read this report, which I really, really like. So I want to give Sunshine to a report. Just says how boring I am. So it's a report that's called On the History and Future of 100% Renewable Energy Systems Research. And it came out now in the end of July. And in essence, it's a whole group of researchers, both from Finland and from Denmark and Sweden and the US and all over the world. I think there are 26, who did a literature review. So they looked at all of the literature, all of the articles, peer-reviewed articles that had been dealing with, is it possible to have 100% renewable energy system locally, regionally, and globally? Because there's a lot of controversy around that. A lot of oil and gas sector, as the usual, if I should thumb up them, would say, no, it's definitely, there always needs to be oil in the mix. We cannot rely, there are too many. But the outcome of this literature review is that there was an overwhelming conclusion that it both can be done, it can be done before 2050, and it can be done at a low cost. So looking at 666 peer-reviewed articles on the topic of 100% renewable energy systems, there is the conclusion of this compilation or literature review is that yes, it can be done, and we definitely need to get started on it. And what I really like is that they're pushing at the IPCC, they're pushing at some of these big organizations that otherwise are kind of in our ball game if we want to make the change, but who is not really stepping up to it when it comes to fossil fuels. Well, I would at least say here is it's not a smoking gun that might be too hard to say, but there is definitely good evidence that those who say it's not possible are wrong.
And definitely for me, a lot of hope.
Exactly. So
I agree on your sunshine here to these researchers and this report. I can't wait to read it, actually. To summarize today's conversation, what are the thoughts you bring with you when you leave from here?
Like always, when I have this talk about the EU Taxonomy, I get excited, and I do, because I think that there is I see that we reach a point of mutual understanding. We can you can see in the conversations how this is maybe not so complicated. At least you look less confused than when you told me in the beginning that it is, and I hope that's the case, because I think that this can be done in a way where it's understandable. And I might not be the best person at it, but it can be done because it's not that complicated. It is really just looking at a list of things and saying check. Oh, I'm missing that. Well, that can make me improve as a company. So I think that moving out of this conversation and hopefully some of the people who are listening and watching will get the same feeling, and I'm always willing to continue the discussion with anyone who is keen.
I absolutely advise people to engage in contact with you, definitely to continue this conversation, because I do believe that we need to talk about this and it needs to be on everybody's lips, and we need also to take our time to understand it. So thank you, Søren, for helping us to understand this. I will bring with me the gap finder in order to make the transition, definitely. So thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and hopefully I can help you develop also the gap finder, so it'll be even better when you take it to your companies.
It's a deal.
Great.
Great. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you subscribe, you share it to someone who you think should know more about this. Comment and engage with our social media so that we together can make the switch. Take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else. Bye.